Chapter 4. After he finished eating breakfast, Dan was impatient, as ever, to return to Key West. He needed to find out what happened to him between the time his father left with his mother and sister to return to Venezuela and the time he lived in the apartment with Fabio. Yet there was still a question that nagged at his mind. "Where and when do you think Daniel could have landed?" he asked Chippewa as he, too, carried his plate to the sink.
"Let me ask you this, Dan, before I answer your question. What year was your son born, do you know?"
Dan turned from the kitchen counter to stare at the dream maker who had remained seated at the table. "How should I know? I haven't lived that far into the future yet, have I?"
"Yes, you have, Dan. Remember, you fell into your past from 2013, didn't you?"
Dan shrugged. "If you say so." Gustavo knew Dan by now, and he thought this wasn't the time to show his stubborn streak. He got up from the chair and went to stand beside his friend. "What age was he when you last saw him? And I don't mean when you went to Big Cyprus. I mean, when you first left with your wife to visit your past, how old was he?" "He was 20 years old, I believe," Dan answered, looking down at the floor beneath his feet.
"Okay then," Chippewa said, standing up too. "If he was 20 in 2013, then he was born in 1993, yes?"
He began to wash the dishes, not looking up at Dan. "Yeah, I guess that's right. But what are you getting at?" Dan asked. Gustavo grabbed a towel out of the drawer and began drying the plates and glasses that Chippewa had just washed and rinsed. "I think what Chippewa means is that Daniel couldn't have gone anywhere beyond 1993, Dan. But what about the time that you went with him to Iran? That was in 1979, wasn't it?" Dan objected. Chippewa stopped his washing up and turned to Dan, his hands clamped on the edge of the sink.
"You're right, Dan. Daniel went back to 1979 the same as you went back to World War II in Europe when you travelled with your wife to visit the place where your grandmother used to live. Yet these trips, whether yours or Daniel's, were all taken in Damianos' company. And, as you remember, I'm sure Damianos wasn't present when he went for a swim on his own, was he?"
Dan nodded. "So what you're saying is that Daniel couldn't have gone back in time any farther than 1993, is that it?"
"Yes, Dan. Besides which, as Damianos pointed out to you yesterday, he relived his future only to the time he met you in Big Cyprus, right?"
Dan pushed himself off the edge of the counter against which he had been leaning, grabbed another towel out of the drawer beside him and finished drying the breakfast skillet and utensils that Chippewa had just rinsed. "And I can tell you that Malou and I couldn't let him race, especially at Big Cyprus, before he was 15. Dan replied, mellowing a little.
"Okay," Chippewa said. "We've got a window of 15 years in which Damianos should be able to find him."
"What about me? I'm going to be searching for him as well."
"In a way you will be, Dan," Chippewa interposed. "But in order for you to begin retracing your son's steps, you've got to reach 1993 and beyond. Remember, in your case, you can't live a past that you haven't lived yet."
"Does that mean that Dan needs to go farther into his future before he can start searching for his son?" Gustavo asked, folding and hanging his wet towel from one of the kitchen drawer handles.
"Exactly, Gustavo," Chippewa said, looking at Dan. "So you'll need to relive the salient events of your life between 1988 and 1993 before you could start searching for Daniel, yes?"
"And is that why Damianos began searching for my son before I could do so?"
"Yes, Dan. He and your family will be able to travel to all those places where Daniel might have landed before you even reached 1993.
"Right," Dan said decisively, hanging his towel such as Gustavo had done a moment ago. "Let's get started then. We've got some catching up to do." He marched out of the kitchen and into the living room. He stopped in front of the large bookcase that lined the wall on either side of the fireplace. "Do you think any of these books could tell me anything about what I was doing in 1988 besides living in that apartment in Key West with Fabio?" he asked as his two companions joined him.
"No, Dan. As you know, the books lining the walls throughout this house only address specific problems and give specific answers to people such as yourself who have decided to revisit their past to solve that particular problem."
"And you think I haven't got a problem that needs solving?" Dan challenged, glaring down at Chippewa. "Come on, Dan," Gustavo interposed. "Why don't you let go and get ready to go back to Key West?" Dan shook his head. "Sorry, I'm still riled up. I still can't believe God himself would let this happen." The despair in Dan's voice was heartbreaking.
"God has given you a choice, Dan. Whatever else happened in the meantime is not of his doing. Right now he is probably ensuring Daniel's safety, but Daniel has made the wrong choice by going swimming beyond time and place, and now he has to work his way back to you."
"How could he?" Dan demanded.
"Well, such as I explained to Gustavo this morning, Daniel will most probably resume his search for you once he's recognised where he is and what he was doing at the time he landed."
"I suppose we could only hope he's clever enough to do that," Dan remarked, shoving his hands in his jeans pockets. "Don't start selling him short of his capabilities, Dan," Gustavo countered. I've seen him in action, remember? He's got more guts than good sense sometimes, I have to admit, but he is courageous and determined. If he's decided to find you, he will do so, mark my word. Okay, Gustavo, I hear you, Dan replied, smiling at his friend. So what are we doing now? How do we get back to Key West? When Daniel went down for breakfast that morning, he found Leah, Mike and Oswaldo sitting around the breakfast table chatting about the storm that hit Western Canada during the night. How's Sleepyhead this morning? Mike asked, turning to Daniel, a broad smile on his lips. Sorry, Daniel said, taking a seat on the empty chair at the table. I woke up early and then I fell back to sleep. No matter, Leah said, getting up. Are you hungry? I've got pancakes, sausages, or I can whip you an omelette if you prefer. She looked at Daniel inquiringly. I'll have whatever everyone else is having, thank you, Mrs. Gomez. Don't go to any trouble for me. Okay then, pancakes and sausages it is, Leah said, turning to the stove to pour some more batter in the skillet. Help yourself with juice and coffee. While Daniel poured himself a glass of orange juice from the jug on the table, Oswaldo asked, Any more thoughts on what happened to your parents? Not much, Daniel answered after he swallowed a long gulp of juice. All I know is that we came to Key West to look for my dad. Your dad wasn't with you on the cruiser then? Oswaldo asked, pouring some maple syrup on his last pancake. No, he wasn't, sir. See, we had taken a trip from Fort Lauderdale on the cruiser and we went to go to Key Largo. Dad went away on his own and didn't come back. Daniel was determined not to involve the little family into this story of tracking his dad through time. He felt unsure as to what Mr. Gomez would do if he told him what really happened. And do you think his disappearance is linked to your mum leaving you behind? Leah asked as she deposited a plate of pancakes in front of Daniel. Well, maybe my older brother decided to look for Dad first, I don't know. And who else was on the cruiser with you then? Mike asked, wiping his plate clean with his last forkful of pancake. Daniel swallowed a bite before he replied. There was just Mum, Gabby, that's my little sister, my older brother Stefano, and an old friend of ours, Damianos. How old is Stefano? Oswaldo asked. He's 22. He came down for a holiday before he started university, Dan replied. Were they awake when you left the boat, do you recall? Dan shook his head. No, everyone was asleep. I just thought I would go for a swim before breakfast, that's all. He continued eating, bowing his head down to his plate not to show the tears that were menacing to break free from the rims of his eyes. You see, son, Oswaldo said after a moment of silence, this situation is really too strange to be untrue, yet I feel there's something you're not telling us. He fixed his gaze on Daniel. So why don't you tell us what's really happening? I don't really think you could believe me if I told you, sir. Listen, Daniel, Oswaldo said. There's no way we could help you if you don't come out with it. And I think after you saved Mike's life yesterday, the least we can do is listen to your story, however fantastic or unbelievable you might think it may be. Daniel nodded. Thank you, Mr. Gomez, but before I tell you anything, please remember that I'm not crazy and that I'm not schizo. Everything I'm going to say is the God-honest truth. Okay then, Oswaldo said. Let's have it. Where the hell are we? Gustavo exclaimed, and looking around him he started laughing. Chippewa? Really? A broom closet? Unable to contain his laughter too, Chippewa got up from a small bench seat and said, Sorry about that, fellows, but I couldn't risk any of us being seen when we landed. Dan looked around him. He wasn't laughing. He was trying to recall where this place was. I've got it, he shouted in the confines of the very small room. You've got what? Gustavo asked. All I see are brooms, mops, towels, plastic gloves and a vacuum cleaner. Is that what you mean? No, Gustavo, I remember where we are. It's the janitor's room of the building where I worked. You worked as a janitor? Gustavo asked, astounded. How did you land this job? Did you apply for the first ad you saw in the paper or what? No, well, not really. It was the first job that I could find. I mean, I recall that I needed money fast, and working as a janitor in this place provided me with money and a roof over my head. Don't tell me you lived in this closet too? Let me explain, Chippewa interposed. Now that Dan is remembering what he was doing here, let me tell you why. Okay, go ahead, Gustavo said, chuckling still. I'd sure like to hear that one. Dan looked down at the floor. He felt as he had felt time and again ever since his family had left him to return to Venezuela. His father had lost his fortune and the life Dan once knew had gone by the wayside. No more Mercedes in the driveway, no more partying with friends, no more nights on the town, and no more spending the money he no longer had. You see, Gustavo, Dan found a janitor, landscaping and maintenance job for a medical outfit housed on the floors above us.
He had no experience at all, but passed the interview with flying colours. He was hired in the next couple of days. The job was very hard since it required for him to do a lot.
And because of my financial situation, Dan added, I took up residence in here. I worked in this building from 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. and then I would sleep in the building at times in the doctor's offices on the floor because of the AC. And around 4:30 a.m. I would wake up and then go to my next job. I would leave that early so the doctors would not find me sleeping in their offices. During my breaks at the other job, I would take power naps to take a shower. I would go to the gym nearby since I had membership there. There, I would have a locker with shampoo, soap, and I would do my laundry in the building, so I always had clean clothes and underwear. His voice trailed off. He sat down on an upturned bucket. No shame in that, Dan, Gustavo said consolingly. Remember, we slept in worse places than this, you and I. And we even had to ask for food money from Mrs. Stevens, the social worker. Remember that? Dan lifted his gaze to his friend. Sorry, I keep thinking of Daniel. I feel I've done the same thing to him as my father did to me.
No, son, Chippewa interposed firmly. You've done nothing of the sort. You've not lost a fortune, and you've not accepted for your son to live on his own and defend for himself. The two situations are totally different. What happened to Daniel was an unfortunate accident. Besides, I'm not sure someone will be able to help him.
Dan shook his head. I sure hope so, Chippewa, because he's had a spoiled life.
And you didn't? Chippewa exclaimed. Why don't you start believing in your son instead of mourning his departure?
Chippewa is right, Dan, Gustavo piped in. I told you, your son's got guts, and he'll see his way through this. Okay then, Dan said, getting up from the bucket. Do you have any idea of the time? He asked Chippewa.
I think it's about 4:30 a.m. now. Why? Do you remember why you got up and began working so early in the morning?